into the Grenfell fire this week, but also very distressed that years later there are still people living in unsafe buildings, many of whom might be watching this morning. Can you tell people who cannot right now sleep easy in their beds?
Keir Starmer walked into that interview with Laura Kuenssberg expecting a tough conversation. But what he got was a relentless barrage of questions that left him scrambling for answers. From the slow progress on Grenfell Tower safety to his broken promises on tax hikes, Kuenssberg didn't hold back, grilling him with the kind of intensity that had everyone on edge. With Starmer struggling to defend himself, the real question is, can he recover from this brutal takedown, or has the damage already been done?
First, I accept it's my duty of this government and everybody in a position of responsibility to make sure they are safe in their home. We will accelerate the programme. I'm frustrated that it's going as slowly as it is.
Laura Kuenssberg kicked off the interview by diving straight into one of the most emotionally charged topics in recent UK history, the Grenfell Tower fire. Her opening questions focused on the cladding issue, which continues to leave many people living in fear, unsure if their homes are safe from fire hazards. She didn't hold back, immediately pointing out that despite years of public outcry and government promises, many buildings are still covered in unsafe cladding. When will people be able to sleep easy in their beds? She pressed, clearly reflecting the anxiety and frustration felt by those who have waited too long for answers. The stakes of the question were obvious. This wasn't just about policy, it was about the safety of people's homes and lives.
When I responded to the report, I said this has to be a turning point. It does, and we need to speed that up and get on with it as quickly as possible.
Forgive me, Prime Minister, during the election campaign, you made great play of how ready you were, how much preparation you had done, how much you were going to walk in this building and get things done.
Keir Starmer, who had just stepped into his role as Prime Minister, found himself cornered by the question. His response was a mixture of frustration and defensiveness. Starmer acknowledged that progress had been slow, but he tried to explain it away, suggesting that part of the delay was due to the complex nature of identifying who should be held responsible for carrying out the necessary safety measures. He mentioned that the money was there and the government had the intention to move faster, but he couldn't commit to a concrete deadline. Instead, he repeated that they were working to accelerate the programme, but Kuenssberg wasn't having it. She asked the same question again, driving home the point that people just want a clear answer about when they can feel safe in their own homes.
And to hold people to account for getting on with the job. The money is there, the intention is there, we need to move more quickly on it.
So by when will people who are watching this, who are living in blocks that are unsafe, will they be able to...
Starmer's inability to provide a specific date or timeline only seemed to fuel Kuenssberg's relentless follow-up. She pointed out that the Grenfell fire happened years ago and Starmer had been in opposition long enough to know the situation. This wasn't a new problem, and the fact that the government couldn't yet provide concrete answers reflected poorly on its preparedness. Her questioning seemed to expose the lack of urgency within the government's response to the cladding issue, which made Starmer look unprepared and defensive. His vague promises to get things done as quickly as possible didn't satisfy, especially when people were still living in unsafe homes. At this moment, Kuenssberg expertly framed Starmer's government as dragging its feet on an issue that should have been a top priority. Her line of questioning exposed the gap between what was promised and what had been delivered. Starmer, despite his best efforts, came across as evasive and out of touch with the urgency of the situation. He was caught in a position where all he could offer were intentions rather than solutions. This exchange wasn't just about policy failure, it was about trust, and Kuenssberg's questioning made it clear that many people were losing faith in the government's ability to deliver on such a critical issue.
How does make people feel better off, to improve public services, to deal with crime, deal with immigration and issues like that? I am absolutely clear in my own mind that we can't bring about that change if we don't fix the fundamentals.
During the election campaign, One of Keir Starmer's key promises was that his government would not raise taxes. He emphasised how ready he was to take charge and claimed that he had a plan to deliver on his promises without burdening the British public with additional taxes. However, just 3 months into his term, Starmer found himself in a situation where he had to break that very promise. His government had no other choice but to raise taxes, and this became another major point of contention in Laura Kuenssberg's hard-hitting interview. Kuenssberg didn't miss the opportunity to call him out on this broken promise. She skillfully reminded Starmer of how he had campaigned on the idea of no tax increases, only for his government to go back on that pledge so soon. It wasn't just about the fact that taxes were rising, it was about the trust that had been broken with the voters who took him at his word. Kuenssberg pressed him on whether this decision reflected a deeper issue within his government's approach, suggesting that voters would see this as a betrayal of his campaign platform. She pointedly asked whether this U-turn would make people question his credibility and leadership.
You're in charge now. Why can't you give people a date?
And what comes with being in charge is responsibility. The responsibility to make sure this happens as soon as possible. The first thing that therefore needs to happen, and the Deputy Prime Minister is doing this, is going through the books, going through the buildings.
Starmer, on his part, tried to justify the tax rise by explaining the economic realities that his government inherited. He spoke about how the previous administration had left the economy in a precarious state, with a massive budget deficit and no clear way forward. According to Starmer, tough decisions had to be made to ensure long-term stability, and raising taxes was part of that. He framed the decision as one of necessity, not choice, and insisted that it was the only way to keep public services running and to avoid deeper economic turmoil. He acknowledged that it wasn't a popular decision, but in his view, it was the responsible one. Kuenssberg's sharp questioning highlighted the contradictions between Starmer's campaign rhetoric and the reality of governing. She didn't let him off the hook, continuously pointing out how his promise not to raise taxes had been one of the cornerstones of his election platform. By juxtaposing his past statements with the current situation, Kuenssberg skillfully exposed the gap between what was promised and what was being delivered. She framed it not just as an economic decision, but as a political one that could damage his credibility.
It's over 2 years. So again, when it comes to winter fuel allowance, that was a choice. It was a political decision for the reasons that you say you want to sort out the economy. But how can you justify it to viewers who feel like it is an attack?
The decision to cut the winter fuel allowance for the majority of pensioners was one of the most controversial moves made by Keir Starmer's government. It wasn't just a matter of reducing a benefit. It was seen as an attack on some of the most vulnerable people in the country, particularly during a time when the cost of living was spiralling out of control. Energy prices were soaring, and pensioners, many of whom were already struggling to make ends meet, were left wondering how they would cope with the harsh winter months ahead. For years, the winter fuel allowance had been a lifeline for many elderly people, helping them cover the cost of heating their homes. The decision to cut it felt like a betrayal to those who had worked hard their entire lives, only to be abandoned when they needed support the most. During the interview, Laura Kuenssberg read a pointed question from a pensioner, expressing deep disappointment and frustration over the government's decision. The question was from someone who had voted for Starmer, only to feel completely let down by this first major policy change. It wasn't just about the financial hit, it was about the principle. How could a government that claimed to care about its people start by targeting pensioners, the very group that couldn't strike or protest to show their disgust? Kuenssberg's reading of the question highlighted the deep sense of betrayal felt by many pensioners. But Kuenssberg wasn't going to let him off that easily. Her questioning highlighted the growing dissatisfaction among the public, particularly pensioners, and framed Starmer as out of touch with their struggles. It wasn't just about the allowance being cut. It was about the broader issue of how pensioners were being treated amid a cost of living crisis. Energy prices had skyrocketed, inflation was eating away at people's savings, and now even the most basic support was being taken away. Kuenssberg's relentless questioning forced Starmer to confront the fact that, while his government may have had its reasons, the public wasn't convinced. To many, this move felt like a cold, calculated decision that hurt those who were least able to cope with it. It painted Starmer as someone more concerned with balancing the books than with understanding the real impact his policies were having on everyday people.
Stabilise our economy. I'm absolutely clear, in the same way, Laura, as I was 4 or 5 years ago when you were interviewing me and I said in order for Labour to win an election, we have to change the Labour Party. Equally clear in my mind, in order to deliver the change, which we will deliver.
One of the key themes throughout the interview was the state of the UK economy, and Laura Kuenssberg didn't shy away from putting Keir Starmer under intense pressure on this issue. She continually pressed him on how his government was handling the economy, challenging him to justify the tough decisions that had already been made, like the tax rises and cuts to public benefits. From the very beginning of the conversation, Kuenssberg made it clear that the public was losing patience with the government's narrative of doom and gloom when it came to the economy. People were tired of hearing how bad things were. What they wanted was action and results.
Was to audit the books. What she found was a £22 billion black hole this year. Now, she had a choice: pretend it isn't there, walk past it, or deal with it.
Now,
I just want to deal with it.
I just want to stop you there. I just want to stop you there. On that 22 billion.
Starmer's defence centred around the idea that his government had inherited a financial disaster from the previous administration. He spoke at length about the £22 billion black hole that had been left behind, explaining that there was no choice but to raise taxes and cut back on certain spending to fix the situation. He argued that public sector pay rises, particularly for key workers like junior doctors, had contributed to this financial strain. But he stood by those decisions as necessary for keeping vital services running. Starmer framed these actions as tough but responsible choices that had to be made to secure the long-term health of the economy. But Kuenssberg wasn't satisfied with this answer. She challenged Starmer on whether his government was managing the public's expectations too much by constantly focusing on the economic difficulties. Was all this talk of austerity and hard decisions just a way to lower people's expectations so that they wouldn't demand more? Kuenssberg pushed Starmer to explain how, if the situation was so dire, he could still justify giving public sector pay rises while at the same time cutting benefits and allowances for vulnerable groups. Her line of questioning forced Starmer to confront the inherent contradictions in his government's approach.
Unsafe blocks have heard politicians for years promise that they were going to speed it up, promise that they were going to accelerate it. It's exactly the kind of frustration that you yourself say you've heard and you understand. And yet here you are today, unable to give them a firm promise.
Well, I'm not going to give a false promise.
During the interview, Laura Kuenssberg asked Keir Starmer a question that cuts right to the heart of his political strategy. Is he willing to be unpopular? It was a critical moment because it forced Starmer to confront a truth that many politicians try to avoid. The reality that making tough decisions often alienates voters. Starmer didn't hesitate in acknowledging that he's ready to take unpopular steps if it means securing long-term stability for the country. He used an analogy, comparing the country's situation to a house with rotting foundations. According to Starmer, you can either paint over the cracks and pretend the problem isn't there, or you can tear it all down, fix the foundations, and rebuild something strong and lasting. He made it clear that he's choosing the latter, knowing full well that it won't win him any popularity contests in the short term. But Kuenssberg wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. She pushed further, asking if this willingness to be disliked might end up costing him more than he's prepared to lose. By making these tough choices, is Starmer risking the support of the very voters he'll need in the next election? This was a crucial question because, while Starmer might believe he's doing what's right for the long term, politics is still a game of winning public approval. Kuenssberg's framing of this issue exposed the tightrope Starmer is walking. Can he afford to alienate voters, especially when so many feel like they've been let down by politicians before?